Hi everyone, welcome to the podcast. Today I'm talking to someone with a really unique story. She was born in the US, studied in Ukraine, and now lives in Poland. We're gonna talk culture shocks, identity, languages, and what it's like to grow up between three worlds. I am Maxim, and let's start. So, can you tell us a little about where you grew up in the US?
Well, hello. My name is Kaylee Elizabeth Akers. I was born in a small town in the state of Alabama, in Florence, Alabama. It's not very big. My parents are country people. They're from smaller towns. So that's where I was born. But when I was about 1 year old, my family moved to Tennessee so that my dad could study at seminary. And when he was studying at seminary, he saw that many students returned to their hometowns in that region. And he saw that many people were not traveling anywhere else or sharing the gospel in other places. So that's what started my parents asking maybe we should go somewhere else to share about the gospel and about Jesus. And my mom told my dad, I will not go anywhere with snakes. And I had asthma, so we could not go to Russia. So Ukraine was the only place with no snakes and no pollution. And so that's how my family ended up in Ukraine.
Wow, that was interesting. So, what was your first impression of Ukraine when you first arrived?
Well, my family arrived in Ukraine in September of 1999. So before that, I had been living in Alabama and Tennessee, and the climate there is very different. It's very hot and humid. So my first memory and impression of Ukraine was that it was very cold, but also that was really fun because of the snow.
And do you remember your very first day in Ukraine and what happened then?
To be honest, I don't truly remember, but I do remember that winter when we had snow. And every time it would snow, my dad would come into our room and ask, Who prayed for snow? And so I would always raise my hand. It was me. I prayed that God would give snow, and He gave a lot of snow that year.
Okay, so can you name, please, three things you think Ukraine does better than the US?
This is a topic that I love discussing, and I do think there are more than three things. But firstly, I would say that Ukrainians are more collective and more relational, and they just really enjoy being around each other. It's not as much about what they do, but about being together. On a more practical note, I do think Ukrainians have better bread. And I would even say better than Polish bread. No offense, Poland. But the bread is really delicious. I think also when you're looking at the current environment in Ukraine, they have more modern technology that they use. The internet is faster in Ukraine. They also have a variety of apps that you can use to pay. And so, in that way, there's more progression.
Were there any Ukrainian traditions or holidays that you really enjoyed?
There are so many different traditions, but some that are my favorite is when you're in a Ukrainian church, that they often will read poems as a way of worship. I think that that's something unique to Ukrainian people is that they love words, be it words that are said in a poem or words that are part of music. Another tradition that I like is the Thanksgiving Day that's had by the church, the Den Podyaki, which is part of the Feast of Tabernacles from the Bible.
How did the food compare? Do you have a favorite Ukrainian dish? And what is it?
Well, there are some similarities because many Americans do come from Europe. And so maybe the ingredients of the food is similar, but the way it's prepared is different. So I personally didn't feel like I was eating anything that I wouldn't have had in the US, just in a different format. I do have a lot of favorite Ukrainian dishes. I personally enjoy making borscht and holubtsi, and there's also so many others that are my favorite. Um, Banosh is also one of my favorites. But Yes, I think there are some similarities. Ukrainians do eat a lot of bread, though, and a lot of potatoes.
Did you notice any differences in how people make friends in Ukraine versus the US?
Of course, this also depends on the region people are from. Each region in the US is different, and each region in Ukraine is different. I would say, though, overall, that Americans are more task driven. So, one way that they make friends is if there is some kind of maybe biking club or sports club or some activity that they can do together. And that's a way that they make connection. And this connection takes a long time. Whereas for Ukraine, it's not as much about activity as just being together. So you can say, "Come, let's go drink tea," and we can have an activity, but the activity is not the focus. The focus is being together.
And thus, is it difficult to make friends here in Ukraine and Poland?
Of course, it always depends on the person, especially with Ukrainians. I think at this particular time, they are more open, especially if they're outside of Ukraine. To making friends because there's a lot of loneliness in being in a new city, a new community. So overall, I'd say that it's pretty easy to make friends with Ukrainians, and you can go very deeply within a couple of meetings. Even in Ukraine, you have a lot of people who have had to move and relocate. So they tend to also be open to new friendships. Regarding Poland, though, I've only made a few Polish friends. They are very kind and very, very helpful people. But I'm not really in those spaces very often to be interacting with Poles, but the people I've met have been great.
So let's move to life in Poland. What brought you to Krakow?
3 years ago, I would have never imagined, like many people, that I would be living in Krakow. Even when I had finished my high school years in Ukraine, I came back to America to study, and then I did not speak or really use Ukrainian for 10 years. So, in my mind, that was part of my past. That wasn't something that really affected me or anything like that. But then actually, I began having some students from the far east in Russia when I was an English teacher. And I just noticed with those students that they liked me and we were able to connect easier. So at that point, I began to think if it is a little bit easier to connect with students from the far east of Russia, then maybe I should be using my cultural knowledge and language with Ukrainian people. So at that time, about 5 years ago, I began praying about working with Ukrainian people. And so I had already decided to join a team that was working in Lviv and working with local churches there. But then the war started, and so I was not able to move into Lviv. But my team was relocated and they moved to Poland. And so that's how I ended up in Poland. But really, it was also from a desire of seeing so many people who were from Ukraine, but they were from areas or regions where they just didn't have gospel access. And so people who had never heard about Jesus, and there was a great need for hope and to share the good news of Jesus with those people. And so that's what has brought me to Krakow. And so I work with Ukrainian people here.
And how would you describe the vibe of the city to someone who has never been?
I would say that Krakow is a slower pace of life compared to other cities in Europe. People take their time, they enjoy going on walks or even at restaurants. You don't have people rushing to leave, rushing to get out. So the pace of life is slower. There's also a lot of history in this city that the Polish people are very proud of. They're very patriotic and they love their history and they love this city. So there's a lot to see and to just also be inspired by how the Polish people have persevered in their history.
And do you find life in Poland more similar to Ukraine or the US?
Overall, I would say that it is more similar to Ukraine. Of course, there are some differences between Ukrainian and Polish culture, but there is quite a bit that overlaps in the love for community, the patriotic nature of both peoples due to their history and even some of the more traditional aspects in the music and the dancing. However, I would say that perhaps compared to Ukrainians, Polish people are more individualistic. Not as individualistic as Americans, but perhaps a little more so as you're moving farther west into Europe.
Is there anything unique about Polish culture that you have grown to love?
One thing that I really appreciate from Polish people is their love for their culture, for their language. I've noticed even when I go to Polish churches that most of their music is written by Polish people. Whereas in some Ukrainian churches, they have a lot of music that's translated from English. And sometimes I wish in Ukrainian churches I would hear more Ukrainian music, not translated. So that's something that I really like about Polish churches.
Okay, and the last part of our podcast is personal growth and stories. Looking back, how has this move shaped you as a person?
A major influence that this has made in my life is firstly just understanding um, that the Lord has many people from many different cultures who love him, and that there's things that we can learn from each other. There's things that I can learn from Ukrainian people. There's things I can learn from Polish people, and that he's the same God. Although we have many different cultures and languages, he's the same. He's never changed. Also, I speak as a native language English, which has a lot of global power. And so learning a language that does not have as much power, Ukrainian specifically, has opened my eyes to understanding how different people in the world live, but also the importance of those languages, that they're needed and they're just as important, they're just as special and just as unique.
Thank you. And if you could bring one thing from Ukraine and one thing from the US into your life in Poland, what would they be?
Well, practically, I think I would just wish to take people from Ukraine and people from the US, my friends and loved ones. That's, of course, the first thing I would say. But maybe in a different way, like the culture, for example, I really appreciate how creative Americans are. They're very ambitious and a desire to see something new. And so a lot of that creativity is very exciting. From Ukraine, I think the ability to quickly come together as a community and to gather. I think if you had those two things working together, the community and the creativity, it would be amazing.
Well, and what advice would you give to someone thinking about living in a new country?
The advice I would share was just something that someone shared with me years ago that has changed my perspective. And when you're in a new culture, it's really important to be open. And he said that we have two types of questions that we can ask in a new culture: a healthy why question and an unhealthy why question. An unhealthy why question is when we ask, what's wrong with these people? Why are they like this? I don't understand what's going on. And a healthy why question is when we ask, hey, I noticed something. Could you please explain why people do this? And so, really, we should have zero unhealthy why questions, but plenty of healthy why questions, especially if you can find someone in that culture who will be able to answer those questions for you. So, that's my advice: to be open and to be asking good questions. Why? Not in a negative way.